Imagine you are told that history is a series of maps, that it is a collection of dates, kings, and tidy borders. Imagine believing that the past is a finished book where the winners were heroes and the losers were just footnotes. Now imagine the moment you realize that the most important parts of the story were never written down. They were whispered in the dark. They were hidden in the blood-stained corners of a mosque. They were buried under the comfortable version of history you were given. This is not the history of a war. This is the history of what happens when the rules of the world simply stop existing. History is often taught as a clash of civilizations. You are told about two worlds, two faiths, and a long, complicated war that neither side fully understood. This is the version that makes it easy to sleep at night. It is the version that focuses on the armor of the knights, the strategy of the generals, and the political maps of the Middle East. It is a version that leaves out the human scream. Specifically, it leaves out what happened inside the walls of Jerusalem on the 15th of July, 1099. To understand the horror of that day, you first have to understand the peace that came before it. In the summer of 1099, Jerusalem was not a ruin. It was not a dusty outpost. It was one of the most sophisticated, vibrant cities on the face of the earth. Inside its massive stone walls, life was a beautiful, complicated layer of humanity. Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian communities had lived side by side for generations. They shared the same streets. They breathed the same air. The markets were not just places to buy food. They were the crossroads of the world. You could find silk from China, spices from India, and glassware from Byzantium. In the libraries, scholars debated philosophy while children played in courtyards that had been owned by their families for 100 years. The women of Jerusalem in 1099 were not living in constant terror. They were mothers. They were daughters. They were weavers and teachers. They believed in the logic of their world. They believed that because their city was holy, it was protected. They had heard the reports, of course. News traveled slowly, like a dark cloud moving across the horizon. They knew a massive army was coming. They knew that tens of thousands of men from France, Normandy, and Italy had crossed the sea. They knew these men carried crosses on their shields and fire in their hearts. But the women felt safe. Why? Because Jerusalem had walls. Jerusalem had a garrison of trained soldiers. It had a governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, who was a rational military man. He had taken every precaution. He had poisoned the wells outside the city so the enemy would have nothing to drink. He had driven away the livestock so they would have nothing to eat. He had sent urgent messages to Cairo, demanding a relief army. The logic of the time said that if you could hold out for a few weeks, the enemy would wither away in the heat. The logic said that the walls would hold. But there was a ghost haunting those walls. A story that the refugees brought with them. It was the story of a place called Mar'era. In Mar'era, the Crusaders hadn't just won a battle. They had done something that broke the scales of human behavior. They had run out of food, and in their desperation, or perhaps something darker than desperation, they had eaten the dead. Not just the soldiers. Everyone. The reports were fragmented. They were hard to believe. Surely, men who claimed to be men of God would not boil adults in pots. Surely, they would not roast children on spits. The women of Jerusalem heard these whispers and pushed them away. It was too horrific to be true. It was just a rumor meant to scare them. They looked at their strong walls. They looked at the holy sites. They believed that prayer and stone would be enough. They didn't realize that the men outside those walls had been traveling for 3 years. They didn't realize that these men had watched their friends die in the dust of Anatolia. They didn't realize that the army outside had developed a relationship with violence that no longer had a ceiling. The sun rose on the 15th of July. The logic was about to break. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks of a heat that the people of that time described as unbearable. The sun was not just a light, it was a weight. It pressed down on the armor of the Crusaders and the stones of the city until everything felt like it was about to crack. Inside the walls, the women watched from the rooftops. They saw the Crusader camp stretching across the dry hills. They saw the thousands of tents, the banners of the knights, and the dust that never settled. But mostly, they saw the thirst. The governor's plan was working. The poisoned wells had turned the water into a weapon. Outside the walls, the Crusader army was dying. Men were licking the dew off the grass in the morning. They were digging into the dry earth with their bare hands, hoping to find a single drop of moisture. Horses were collapsing. The great army that had traveled thousands of miles was fracturing. The knights were arguing. The soldiers were deserting. To the women watching from the battlements, it looked like the city had already won. The desert was doing what the swords could not. But then, the wood arrived. 6 Genoese ships had landed at the port of Jaffa. They didn't bring gold. They didn't bring food. They brought the materials for destruction. They brought wood. In a land where trees were scarce and the sun turned everything to tinder, wood was more valuable than silver. The Crusaders dismantled the ships themselves. They carried the planks and the beams across the jagged hills on their backs. They were no longer just soldiers. They were builders. In total secrecy, behind massive barriers of brush and cloth, the Crusaders began to build. The people inside Jerusalem could hear the sound, the rhythmic thud of hammers, the screech of saws. It was a mechanical sound that didn't belong in a city of prayer. It was the sound of a countdown. The women in the markets tried to ignore it. They focused on the 3 weeks. The governor told them the relief army from Egypt was only 3 weeks away. 3 weeks was all they needed. If the walls could stand for 21 more days, the Crusaders would be crushed between the stone and the Egyptian swords. But the Crusaders weren't waiting for 3 weeks. They were building 2 massive wooden structures, siege towers. They were as tall as the city walls themselves. They were covered in animal hides to protect them from fire. They were rolling fortresses designed for one purpose, to bridge the gap between the earth and the sky. On the night of July 13th, the silence of the desert was broken. The defenders on the wall looked out into the darkness and saw something moving. It wasn't an army of men. It was the towers. They moved with a slow, inevitable momentum. The creak of the wood sounded like a giant waking up. The defenders poured fire down on them. They threw stones. They used long poles to push against the wooden frames. They fought with a desperation that only comes when you realize the logic of your safety is failing. For 2 days, the battle was ferocious. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and rotting hides. The women inside the houses could hear the screams of the men on the walls. They could hear the towers thudding against the stone. The 3-week deadline was still 10 days away. The relief army was too far. The walls were no longer a shield. They were a cage. By the morning of July 15th, the northern tower made contact. A bridge was lowered. A knight named Lethold was the first to step onto the parapet. Behind him came a flood. The Crusaders did not enter Jerusalem like liberators. They did not enter like men who wanted to rule a city. They entered like men who had been waiting 3 years for a release. They had decided, collectively and without hesitation, that once they crossed that line, no rule of God or man applied to them anymore. The floodgates were open, and the women of Jerusalem were standing directly in the path of the water. The wall was breached, and the silence of the city died. When the knights stepped from the wooden towers onto the stone parapets, the defenders didn't just lose a battle, they lost their world. The Crusaders didn't pause. They didn't stop to negotiate. They poured into the narrow streets of Jerusalem like a red tide. For 3 years, these men had been told that this city was their prize. They had been told that the people inside were not humans, but obstacles. And on that Friday morning, they acted with a collective, terrifying clarity. The women in the houses heard the change in the air. The sound of clashing steel was replaced by something much worse, the sound of doors being kicked in, the sound of running feet. History books often talk about the fall of Jerusalem as a political event. They talk about the kingdom of Jerusalem being born. They don't talk about the woman who stood in her kitchen, listening to her neighbors being murdered in the alleyway. They don't talk about the frantic calculations made in those final minutes. Where do you go when the walls fail? Where do you hide when the logic of safety is gone? Thousands of people, mothers holding infants, elderly men who could no longer run, families who had lost each other in the smoke, all made the same desperate choice. They ran to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They ran there because it was the holiest place they knew. They believed, with a deep and ancient faith, that even a man with a sword would respect the house of God. They believed that the sacredness of the stones would act as a second wall. They barricaded the doors. They huddled together in the dim light of the dome. Inside the mosque, the air was thick with the smell of old dust and thousands of people breathing in terror. It was a sound that history forgot to record, the low, humming vibration of thousands of people praying in a dozen different languages, all asking for the same mercy. They listened to the city dying outside. They heard the screams getting closer. They heard the iron boots of the knights hitting the pavement. Raymond of Aguilas, a chaplain who was actually there, later wrote about what he saw. He wasn't a victim. He was a witness on the side of the winners. He described walking through the city that afternoon and seeing blood that reached his knees. He didn't write this with horror. He wrote it as a celebration. He saw the slaughter as a judgment of God. But inside the mosque, it didn't feel like a judgment. It felt like the end of the world. The women held their children's faces against their chests so they wouldn't see the shadows moving past the high windows. They waited for the relief army that was still 2 weeks away. They waited for a miracle. They waited until the sound of the hammers, the same hammers that had built the siege towers, began to strike the mosque doors. When the doors finally broke, the light that poured in was blinded by the flash of steel. The killing inside the mosque was immediate. It was total. No one was spared because of their age. No one was spared because of their gender. The Crusaders had spent weeks dying of thirst, watching their friends rot in the sun. Now, they were quenching that thirst with violence. The mosque, which had been a place of sanctuary for centuries, became a slaughterhouse in the space of a single hour. And then, at some point, the killing stopped. No one knows exactly when the silence returned. But when it did, it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a city that had been emptied of its soul. The women who were still alive at that moment found themselves in a world where their names, their families, and their rights had vanished. They were no longer people. They were spoils of war. The killing ended, but the nightmare was just beginning. In the days following the massacre, a strange and cold order descended upon the ruins of Jerusalem. The Crusader commanders, men who had traveled from the courts of Europe to find salvation, began the business of administration. They didn't see a city of mourning. They saw a ledger. The city was carved into jurisdictions. Each lord took a district. Each knight took a street. And with the buildings came the contents. This is the part of history that isn't written in bold letters. The women who survived the mosque were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as furniture. They were recorded in the division of spoils the same way a farmer records his livestock. Not by name, not by age, not by the families they had lost. They were categorized by their use. A woman who had woken up that morning as a mother, a neighbor, or a wife, someone with a history and a soul, was, by sunset, merely a line in an inventory. There is a letter that still exists in the historical records. It was written by a Crusader knight to his family back in France. He describes the beauty of the city he has helped conquer. He talks about the architecture, the golden domes, and the quality of the loot he has secured. He lists his prizes. First, he mentions the silk carpets. Then, he describes the quality of the silverware. And then, tucked between the description of the household goods and a note about the weather, he mentions the woman. Her name is not there. Whether she was someone's daughter or someone's mother is not important to him. She is listed as an object, a reward for his holy mission. The letter ends with a request for his family to pray for his continued health. Imagine the life of that woman. She was forced to perform labor in the very streets where she had once walked as a free person. In some cases, these women were kept as servants in the very houses that had belonged to their own families just days before. They watched as the Crusaders remade their world into something unrecognizable. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, where so many had sought God's protection, was converted into a palace for the new king. Later, it became the headquarters of the Knights Templar. The places of prayer were turned into stables and barracks. The women watched from the shadows as a cross was placed atop the dome of the rock. What these survivors endured was a specific, slow-motion destruction. It wasn't the quick death of the sword. It was the grinding away of their humanity. There was no religious authority to speak for them. There was no legal system to protect them. They were surrounded by people who had decided, both individually and as an institution, that their grief did not count, that their loss was not a crime, but a blessing from God. They lived in the ruins of their own lives, serving the men who had destroyed everything they loved. They were the invisible foundation upon which the new kingdom was built. For 88 years, the silence held. Jerusalem became a city of ghosts and stone. The women who had survived the summer of 1099 grew old in the shadows of the new kingdom. A new generation was born, children who only knew the city as a Crusader stronghold, who saw the crosses on the walls and the knights in the streets as the natural order of things. The memory of the massacre was pushed deep into the earth, covered by the comfortable version of history that the winners wrote for themselves. But history has a way of breathing, even under the weight of 88 years. In 1187, the wind changed. A new name began to echo through the hills of Judea, Saladin. He was not just a general, he was a symbol of a world that had not forgotten what happened on July 15, 1099. The Crusader kingdom, once thought to be an eternal fortress, was trembling. The logic of the walls was about to be tested once again. When Saladin's army surrounded Jerusalem, the people inside felt a terror that was nearly a century old. The Christian population, the soldiers, the priests, and the families who had built their lives on the ruins of the old city, expected the same fate they had dealt out. They expected the swords. They expected the mosques to run red again, only this time with their own blood. But Saladin had been told the stories. He knew exactly what had happened in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He knew about the letters written home by the knights. He knew about the women who had been treated like inventory. History stood at a crossroads. This was the moment for the eye for an eye logic that governs so much of human war. But Saladin chose a different path. Instead of a massacre, he offered a ransom. Instead of blood, he offered a departure. He allowed the Christian community to leave the city with their lives. There is a record from his secretary, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who stood at the gates as the Crusaders marched out. He watched them leave, the men who had once called themselves masters, now carrying what they could of their belongings. He saw the women of the Crusader households, women who were now experiencing the same loss of home that the women of 1099 had felt. Isfahani wrote about it with a strange complexity. He felt contempt for the enemies of his faith, but he also felt a flickering of mercy. He saw the human cost of the cycle. Saladin even went so far as to personally pay the ransoms of the poor who could not afford their own freedom. It was a stark contrast that history has never fully decided how to handle. One side entered with the sword and left a legacy of inventory and silence. The other side entered with a treaty and left a legacy of mercy. But even in this better version of history, the original wound remained. The women of 1099 were still gone. Their names were still unwritten. The mercy of 1187 could save the living, but it could not give a voice back to the dead who were buried beneath the silk carpets and the silverware. The shadow of the first massacre was so long that it touched every stone in the city. Even as the crosses were taken down and the crescents were put back up, the ghost of that Friday morning in July remained. It was a reminder that once you break the world, it never quite fits back together the same way. We are taught that history is a series of grand events. We are told it is a story of kings and conquests, of empires rising and falling like the tide. This is the comfortable version. It is the version that fits neatly into textbooks and makes the past feel like a distant, finished thing. But as we have seen, the truth of July 15th, 1099, does not live in the grand events. It lives in the silence that followed them. The Crusades are often framed as a clash of civilizations. This phrase is used to make the horror sound academic. It turns the slaughter into a geopolitical necessity. It suggests that what happened was just the inevitable friction of two great powers rubbing against each other. But that framing is a lie of omission. It is a way to hide from a simple, devastating truth. The women of Jerusalem were not civilizations. They were not symbols of a faith or pieces on a political chessboard. They were people who believed that the world had rules. They believed that a mosque was a sanctuary. They believed that even in the middle of a war, there were lines that no man of God would cross. They were wrong. History did not record their names. It did not record their last words or the names of the children they tried to shield. But they are still there. They are there in the letters written by the knights who saw them as loot. They are there in the floorboards of the houses that were stolen from them. They are there in the inventory between the silk carpet and the silverware. When we look at history through the eyes of the powerful, we see a story of victory. But when we look at it through the eyes of those who were in the Al-Aqsa Mosque that afternoon, we see the reality of what we are capable of when we decide that another human being does not count. The men who committed those acts went home. They kissed their families. They sat in their churches. They asked for prayers for their holy mission. They were able to do this because they had convinced themselves that the women they had captured were not people, but rewards. They had turned their victims into objects so they wouldn't have to feel the weight of their own crimes. Sometimes, complexity is just a comfortable place to hide. We call the Crusades complicated, so we don't have to look directly at the blood on the floor. We call it lead, so we don't have to hear the silence of the woman whose name was never written down. But you are here now. You have looked past the comfortable version. You have seen the inventory. You have heard the doors break. The history of the world is not just what is written in the books you were given. It is what was admitted in the letters home. It is what was recorded in the raw, bleeding testimony of the survivors. It is the story of the people who were left out of the narrative because their pain didn't serve the victory. The next time you hear about a clash of civilizations, remember the woman in the mosque. Remember that she wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a symbol. She was a person who waited for a relief army that was 3 weeks away, and she is still waiting for history to finally say her name. The version of the Crusades you were taught had heroes and villains. But the truth is much simpler and much more haunting. She was there. She is still there. And now, so are you. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.